Yeah, we're going to do a round of presentation, and by way of, I thought I'd present our unit here. We've been doing research in environmental economics for 25 years or something, and building capacity in particularly developing countries. We now have there's 4 professors of environmental economics, or who do environmental economics here in our group, and about 15 doctors and a number of PhD students who are here permanently. We've had some, I think it's 50 now. There's a picture of us. 50 students who have done their PhD. I think those in blue are Swedes and those in red are from developing countries. We showed this to SIDA, who finances us. So that's why there was a differentiation there. And we've oriented our PhD program towards climate economics. We have these specialization courses, of which this is one that you're giving here. We do quite a lot of research collaboration that is sort of interdisciplinary, and there's, I think, 2 or 3 of you here from physical resource theory. And that's one group we've worked a lot with at Chalmers. And now we're working quite a lot with the Bayer Institute, and some of you were there a few weeks ago. We have started these centers that some of you know about, called the Environment for Development centers, in a number of places which we collaborate with. And we're now all writing a gigantic research application together with the Bayer and the Stockholm Resilience Center and all these centers, and applying for more money to do research the next 10 years. I thought we'd do a little quick round of presentations, so I wrote down some of my own personal interests. I've been working on discounting, and I'm going to put in an extra lecture into the schedule somewhere. I haven't quite decided yet where, on discounting. We were going to have one in the natural resource course, but then I got ill, and so I thought I'd squeeze that in here. It fits just as well. It's sometimes been in the policy instruments course and sometimes in the natural resource course. It fits in both. I've also worked on the design of policy instruments, and particularly one called the refunded emission payment, which we'll talk a bit more about. I'll have a lecture next week on that with Carolyn Fisher. I did a lot of work on gasoline taxes, my favorite policy instrument, and a number of other things. I wrote my thesis about Mexico. And currently I'm involved in the IPCC. I'll be gone 10 days of this course. I'll be locked up in Berlin. I'm not allowed to leave. It seems it's 24 hours a day, so I'll probably come back a little tired and quite frustrated, I'm afraid. And then I'm still working also for the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a sort of an advocacy organization in the United States. Now, can we do a little round of presentations? There's some new people, so we have a wonderful span of people from these outer space cloud researchers here to people looking at common property resource management and grazing and many things in between, like urban problems in China, and that has been, it's been a privilege and a joy to have this as my area of specialization. I say that with some kind of citation marks. We always tell, economic professors always tell their students, and I suppose probably a lot of other professors too, that you must specialize on one thing. And so I specialize on policy instruments, and it allows me to work with all these different subjects. And sometimes there are really striking similarities. We use the same policy instrument to manage fisheries as climate forces like carbon dioxide. So it's quite interesting. We actually collect experiences from one area and use it in really very different areas. So this is our schedule. Those of you who are new to the school here will have a little introduction in the afternoon about the library and the school and so on. Then there'll be a block of lectures this week. Market failures, which is sort of the reason why we have pollution and environmental degradation. Then we'll have a couple of lectures on what instruments there are to deal with this. Caroline Fisher will come and give a lecture on the green paradox here, and she and I will together give a lecture on refunded emission payments. Peter Burke will give a lecture on US policymaking in practice. I'll come back here with one on policy instruments and political economy of policy instruments. There'll be a case study. So you will be, this is a so-called Harvard case study. You will be divided up into little groups, and you'll have one company each and work out a lobbying strategy to try to find which instrument is best for your company. And well, there'll be a lecture on integrated assessment modeling, some on monitoring and enforcement, and so on. I'll give one on the IPCC fifth assessment report, which will be just after it becomes public. International treaties, and so forth. There's a little bit more here. There are the 4 seminars in red. They are in your schedule. They are seminars, and they are designed to be specifically about the related topics. So they're very strongly recommended. And then there is 3 or 4 things here that are specific just for the PhD students that are our regular PhD students here in Gothenburg. They will be writing a term paper that is also associated to another course and to this one, and so that's a little bit specific for them. I'm going to hand out the books afterwards. This schedule was handed out. And the articles we don't hand out because that's illegal. At the end there will be a course evaluation. We do this at the end of every course. And we ask you lots of detailed questions about what you thought about each lecture and each thing. And we use that as feedback to make the courses better, of course. We'd like you to read the book as soon as possible and sort of have that as a basis for really participating. It's a big group, but still we want to get active participation. The purpose is, for most of you, is to think about your thesis. Most of you are in that stage where you'll soon be writing a thesis, and this course I think is well designed for that kind of purpose. So you might be thinking about topics that are specifically oriented to the design of policy instruments, or you might also, even if you are not, and you're writing a thesis about something else, there is very often at the end of every thesis chapter and article, there is a page or 2 where you kind of sum up why you did this and what the consequences are. And that's the time to think about this course and this literature, because it makes a big difference if you kind of can explain you valued something. Very many studies value the local lake or something and try to say something about what it's worth. But then you need to, like as a conclusion, to say, well, what's the conclusion of this? What should the policymaker do? And I think that's very important. His book, and the book has 6 parts, and we'll be talking today a little bit about the first 3, and then the other 3 are applications. But there are 3 different parts, and I think you should always think about this when you think about a new problem. Why is there a problem? Why do we need policy? Some people think this is sort of obvious, that there is pollution and that there are problems, but it's not obvious. Particularly not obvious, perhaps, to people who've had a long training in economics, because we are taught that the market economy is so great and sort of the best way of allocating resources. So then we have to ask ourselves why, if we have a market economy, then why do we still have these rather serious problems? And then we want to look at the menu of instruments, what there is to do about this, and then the really big subject is which instrument do you select, when. So, think of a complex problem, and we have some people here from the engineering school. They're very good at figuring out new ways of making lamps so that they use less energy, or pumps so that they use less energy, or all kinds of technical innovations. But then how do we actually get society to use this stuff? And how should society be steering research? And I'll take as an example here of the importance of incentives, a diagram which was taken from a daily newspaper in Sweden called Dagens Nyheter. It shows the number of marriages in Sweden. In 1950 there were almost 60,000 marriages a year, and then it fell. I think the lowest was about 1980 here, when it was down to about 35,000. Do you know why it fell? Less people already got married, nobody left. What explanations would there be? I think it was the power, largely the power of the church was getting lesser in Sweden. And then there was one year, here in 1989, when suddenly 109,000 people got married. Same system. No, I think that came a little bit later, actually. So I don't know. Maybe I'll have to update this and see if there was a new peak. But actually, I don't think that had such a numerical effect. No, there was a change in the law about how widows' pensions are calculated. So it was somehow became just more profitable to be married, or maybe there was an opportunity cost of living together and not being married, and if one person died, the other person's, something about the way the other person's sort of widow benefits were calculated or taxed or something. A seemingly small sort of financial incentive has such a big effect on something so personal as marriages. And then it goes back again, yeah. But still, I mean, to the same level, so there's still a lot of extra people who got married there. I showed this diagram because I've been fighting for decades to persuade people that gasoline taxes have an effect. And I looked for different ways, because there's always some people who think that they don't. Those people are wrong, because I mean there's lots of statistical evidence that they do have an effect, but still they continue to believe that there's no point in taxing gasoline. So this is to show that if an economic incentive can have such an effect on when you get married, or if you get married, then it can surely affect lots of other things, like what size apartment you choose, or what kind of car you choose. And people sometimes say that, oh, but it's all a matter of culture and so on. But many things like culture, as well as technology and so, are ultimately decided by prices. Prices are really important in a market economy, and so that's the most powerful instrument we have. Now let's come back to the question of why we have environmental pollution. It's really stupid to destroy the ozone layer, for instance, or to change the composition of the atmosphere so that the climate on Earth will change. Why do we do it? It's important to think quite a long time about this, because there's a risk that if you have a superficial understanding of the problem, you come up with a superficial policy recommendation. And there is generally a fundamental reason. The market does work very well if the market is allowed to work perfectly, but the requirements for a market to work perfectly are draconian. We have to assume that there are rights to everything. But we have rights in Sweden, for instance, to land. Typically, most land has an owner. Not even that is the case in all developing countries, and in many places in Africa there are land rights which are incomplete or insecure. But we certainly don't have rights to the atmosphere. We don't have rights to there's a lot of water. There's a lot of quite more subtle aspects. This room here is full of all kinds of radiation and properties. There could be, contents of chemicals and so on. We don't have detailed rights on everything there. We make up rights basically when we discover new problems. You go back to the 15th century, there were no property rights to radio waves. Today, of course, you can own a frequency like 98.9 something megahertz in some place. Someone owns that, and you have to pay a lot of money if you want to use it, and you get into a lot of trouble if you use it without owning it. And so a market will work perfectly if there are property rights to everything, and if those property rights don't overlap. There's a problem if there are property rights that kind of overlap, because then you get problems along the borders that are sort of related to what we are going to call externalities. Externalities are really fundamental and important concept. I have a picture here of the Columbia River. One of the first studies in environmental economics was written by a guy called Crutilla, who got the first Volvo Environment Prize in around 1990. And he wrote about the Columbia River. And has anyone, it's an unlikely question, I suppose, but has any one of you know anything about dams? I mean, you could have a father who's been a hydro engineer, or someone, a relative who owns a dam or something. You know something about dams?
Yeah.
That's great. See? So we have a river flowing this way, and here we built a dam. And then we are thinking about building, or suppose we own a dam here as well. We'll make one more dam here. And then someone is thinking about building a dam here. So there can be many dams on a river. And do you know what the value, roughly what is the value of a dam? How would you roughly know the value of a dam? Well, the economic value. Let's say it's for power.
That's easy to do.
Then we have some engineers in the room. So how much power do you get from a dam? What are the two most important variables that will tell you how much? Height. Very good. And the other one? The volume of water. Exactly. Now, in many places, like in Sweden, there are mountains over here, and it snows on the mountains all winter, and then there is a spring, a wonderful time, when the snow sort of melts away and you get a rush of water. And what happens when there is a rush of water? All this water, first it fills up this dam, but there is so much water, just, it does that in a few days, and then it flows on, and it fills each dam. And then there's still too much water, and then that water is, from the point of view of an engineer, is lost. I mean, of course this is nice for the people who like watching the the rush of water, but still, it goes out to sea. So we own this dam here, and we hear that someone is going to build a dam over there, and they decide not to build it. What is our reaction? What do we say? Well, we might say yoo-hoo, but I'm going to claim this time we're going to say the opposite. Because suppose they do build a dam here, then next time there is a spring flood, the water fills up this dam, and then this dam, and then this dam, and then we start producing electricity. We start producing electricity here, and then our water disappears as we produce. But these guys, they are also producing electricity, and when their water releases, it flows into our dam. So they kind of built an extra dam for us. And the value of my power plant here is, this is V1, and this is V2. Then it kind of, it just went up. If they build a dam, my dam becomes twice as valuable, assuming the dams are equally big. I'll have twice as much water. I can produce not only in July and August, I can produce July, August, September, October. That's, and so if they decide not to build, I might call them and say, hey, I have a lot of cement over, you can have it. I mean, their problem here is maybe they think it's not profitable. Well, if I pay the cement for them, maybe they'll build it. So, what is this? This is a positive externality. It's something that affects my profit, but is not in my control. It's in the control of someone else. we don't talk that often about positive externalities. We tend to talk about negative externalities a lot. Negative externalities are the famous ones. I smoke, and then you all get poisoned, or or I make a lot of noise, and then you can't sleep. A lot of environmental externalities are framed as disturbances. I think it's useful to think about the positive externalities as well. Of course, a dam has negative externalities as well. For instance, what are the negative externalities of a dam? If there are some species of fish that migrate, they are in trouble, like the salmon. Yes, they're usually in, particularly in tropical countries, someone will find a frog somewhere here that is maybe unique to that place. And so, and there are sort of the Endangered Species Acts, and so they have to try to relocate the frog or to do something. And of course, sometimes there are some environmental activists who hope that if the frog is sufficiently important that they can stop the dam. So there could be all kinds of environmental effects. You cut down a lot of forest here, you change the ecosystem, you get a different composition of fish. Sometimes you get more fish, but you get another species of fish. And sometimes you get a lot of water standing still, so maybe you get an increase in malaria, or dengue, or well, you get all kinds of changes. So there could be shipping, if it's a big river, shipping may be disturbed, or the other way around, it may become easier to do shipping. So there's lots of effects. I've always been worried that if someone takes the Nile's water, that Egypt will start quite a big war or do something, yeah. I think that's... No. There's no, because there is not... it's not really clear who owns the right. Does Egypt have a right to an undisturbed Nile? The Egyptian civilization has been there for thousands of years, and those people live there because the Nile, I mean, Egypt is heavily populated because of the Nile. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, the water rains in other countries like Ethiopia, and so if they feel that, oh, it's our water because it's raining here, then yeah, there's a conflict of rights. That's not an easy conflict. So, that is one area where we don't have property rights, and so there are externalities. If one person does something, that can affect the property, the production function or the utility function of some other individual. So when my profit function or my utility function is decided by actions done by somebody else, not mediated through the market, then there's nothing very easily I can do about it except negotiate, perhaps. Positive externalities, it's often easier. You can offer to pay because there's actually some money on the table to share. Negative externalities, you have a problem to share, and it's somewhat more difficult. Public goods can be seen as a kind of externality, right? Because it's an externality that one person has on everybody else, so these are goods we consume together. They don't really fit into they can't be decentralized to the market mechanism. We can't let the market decide. We need politics to decide public goods. We need to vote, we need to tax, we need to find other ways of allocating resources to public goods. Asymmetric information is important here. The market also assumes that that everybody has the same full, perfect information. And that's typically not the case. Very often the agents, like the firms, know much more about their own production technology than other people do, than the regulator does. That's an important source of asymmetry. So if you're going to regulate them and you don't know their technology, you kind of have to guess what their technology is, or you have to try some instruments and then see how they react and then adapt the instrument. There could also be variations in risk. A lot of this is sort of assuming that there is always a payoff in dollars, X dollars, but sometimes there is not a payoff of X dollars, there is a probability distribution of X. And we may have different risk tolerance. A typical problem is that rich people, for instance, can afford to be more risk-loving. As long as the average return is high, it doesn't really matter to them if the variance is also high. So they can take risky projects, and people with low incomes, on the other hand, they cannot afford to suffer too much risk, because if there is a year or even a month with a low payoff, that month they may in fact starve. Now, the first examples of the classical examples of externalities that you find in old literature were I think Adam Smith or someone, or maybe Ricardo, wrote about how pleasant it was to walk by a neighbor's rose garden that was beautiful. And you sort of enjoyed the view. And that seems like a pretty trivial example, like a relatively small problem. But we've come to realize that we are in fact facing really big problems. Change in the ozone layer, or a change in the acidity of water, change in the composition of the climate, or the atmosphere that will change the climate. These things can threaten our life on Earth and our well-being and our comfort. We used to study raw materials, natural resources like one problem, and then pollution like another. But in fact, we have to understand now there is a thin layer of Earth where life is possible, where there is oxygen and water and photosynthesis. And it's the same place where we get our resources and where we dump our waste. And sometimes if you take a boat to England, for instance, and across the North Sea, it's very polluted, heavily used sea. There's exploration for oil, there's shipping, there's all kinds of stuff, and yes, that's also where we get our food. Sometimes you look down in this water and you think, my goodness, is that where the fish in the comes from that we eat? And yes, it is. And symbolically, we are all like the people who live on the waste sites and scavenge waste. Except that, of course, their plight is much worse than ours. But in some general sense, we are all living in the same place. We're getting our food from the same biosphere where we are putting our wastes. And it's a very big problem, big scale problem. And have you heard of these ages that what do they call, geologists like to call the Pliocene, Miocene, Eocene, Paleocene, they all end with a scene. So that's now someone very clever invented the Anthropocene. That is the geological age that we are now in. And by that we mean that this is an age when everything on the planet basically is determined by man. Those of us who grow up in cities, we have this romantic view of the countryside. Let's go out into pure nature and sort of see what pure nature looks like. Well, there is no pure nature anymore. In fact, there's one Swedish ecologist wrote a sort of a history book of, he's an old man now, and he wrote a history book of the environmental movement in Sweden, and he said that when he was young and started off as a young environmental researcher, he said that we used to, first we'd go to a factory, each factory would have a sort of little pipe, and at the end of the pipe it would be terrible. It would be dangerous. We would go there, we would study, we would see that there was hardly anything living there at all. And then we'd go 50 kilometers away, there would be a place that was completely pristine and clean. And we would study the gradient and see which animals survived what concentration. And then he said that at the end of his career and sort of writing this book, he went back to some of those worst places. And he said, they are gone. There are no more these really terrible hotspots of pollution where everything is just dead and murky, in Sweden at least. But he said the worst thing is, I look for the clean, pristine places of comparison. They too are gone. There is no place that is really clean. So instead of short pipes with all this effluent, we now have much longer pipes. The OECD in the 1960s, they had a rule saying that you had to have tall chimneys. That is a really laughable environmental policy. A tall chimney just means that you spread the pollution to a larger area. It doesn't really mean that you are, it cannot be called cleanup, right? You're not reducing the total amount of pollution. And a lot of what we do is in fact moving the pollution further away. We call it cleanup. Even when we put a filter in a chimney, what do we do with the filter afterwards? Well, basically we throw it away in a waste dump. And it rains on waste dumps. At least all Swedish waste dumps, it rains on them. So then the content in the filter gets spread again. It gets spread somewhere else. Now, it is sometimes possible to do some real cleanup, but a lot of what we call cleanup is really just moving the shit, if you'll excuse the expression, further away. So that means that everything we are doing on this planet, in fact, is affected by us. And the faster we understand that and start managing it in a sensible way, the better. This is the menu for you. Will be for next hour. After we analyzed what the reasons for the problem are, we need to think of the menu of alternative policies. And I've been working hard here to make a menu for you. This is the menu for this course, kind of. Different policy instruments that you could choose. I could just have this, basically, one slide and talk for many hours just about that. I will come back to this a few times.